Welcome to the scandalous side of Victorian history, where just good friends shared wardrobes, wills, and suspiciously well-trained cats. This is the Empire's best-kept secret, ironed flat by historians and hidden behind doilies. In prison yards and drawing rooms, on stages and séance floors, queer lives bloomed, quietly, cleverly, and absolutely on purpose. And where the world saw silence, they built something louder. If you enjoy drifting off to stories where rules were followed just long enough to be elegantly broken, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully subversive bedtime tales. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre, baffling, and quietly rebellious lives of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, and because there's something oddly soothing about drifting off to tales of coded letters, double lives, and secrets no etiquette book dared to explain. Now dim the lights, get cosy, and slip into a world where repression was expected. And queer desire always found a way to slip past the parlour door. You wake up to the sound of someone shaving your head with what feels like a gardening tool. A woman yells at you for squinting incorrectly. You're not in hell. You're in Van Diemen's Land, soon to be renamed Tasmania, and while it may be on the other side of the world from Buckingham Palace, make no mistake, you are still deep in Victorian territory. Every rule, every expectation, every absurd, soul-crushing moral ideal of 19th century England has arrived here by boat, along with you. This is a British colony operating under full Victorian authority, ideology and law, just with worse plumbing and more venomous spiders. Think corsets, but with extra mould. Your crimes? 1 count of stealing a handkerchief, 2 counts of being poor, and a lifelong sentence of not being man-approved. You were loaded onto a ship, thrown into the bottom like cabbage, and now you've arrived at a place called the Cascades Female Factory, where femininity comes to die and laundry is done with state-sponsored malice. You're issued 1 coarse uniform, 1 bug-infested blanket, and an invitation to join the crime class, which is just as fun as it sounds. The women here speak in a dialect made entirely of sarcasm and side-eyes. There are clicks, there are crushes. There is a woman in the corner smoking something out of a button. She winks at you. You're not sure if it's a threat or a promise, but either way your day just improved. Because here, under the cracked walls and nose-blistering stink of state failure, a strange thing is happening. Women, unwanted, unwashed and unashamed, are forming communities. They trade lace like currency. They pass notes like schoolgirls. They fall in love, or at the very least into something deeply inappropriate by Victorian standards. You've just entered lesbian convict mob territory, and things are about to get extremely unladylike. While most people picture Victorian oppression as a fog-choked London street full of corsets and quiet judgment, the Cascades Female Factory in Van Diemen's Land was something else entirely. More lice, less lace. Built in 1828 and run by the British Empire, it operated under full Victorian law, morality and delusion, just with more humidity and less supervision. This was where broken women were supposed to be fixed, through laundry, sermons, and a strict diet of shame. But instead of reforming into docile wives, many of these women reformed into something far more terrifying to the Empire: lesbians with a social network. Classified into 3 groups, hiring, probationary and crime, the real action happened in the crime class, which was basically queer summer camp with fewer snacks and more surveillance. Here, women formed what officials referred to in their reports as flash mobs, tight-knit cliques who swapped contraband, rewrote gender roles, and fell madly in love with one another, to the horror of anyone in a powdered wig. Reports from the Hobart Town Courier detailed how women in these mobs reshaped their uniforms into men's clothing, shaved their heads, and smuggled lace and rum to win each other's affections. One reverend sobbed in writing that these unnatural practices were spreading faster than the staff could stop them, and Superintendent W.J. Irvine, a man who clearly needed to lie down more often, claimed in a formal report that some inmates had masculine features, lower voices, and artificial implements secured to the person, which is the Victorian way of saying strap-on panic attack. But what really unnerved the authorities wasn't the sex, it was the structure. These weren't fleeting flings. These were organised relationships, with loyalty, power dynamics, and yes, matching earrings. Women got punished, and their lovers would intentionally get punished too, just to rejoin them. Romantic rebellion, with brick-throwing benefits. And that's exactly what happened next, when a woman named Ellen Scott decided that if her girlfriend was going to solitary confinement, the entire prison was coming with her. They've taken her. One minute you're braiding her hair with stolen lace. The next she's being hauled off for insubordination, which in this prison means breathing slightly louder than a Reverend Catherine. Your partner in crime, laundry, and possibly pants sharing, has just been shoved into solitary confinement. No trial, no warning, just a matron with a Bible, a grudge, and exactly one eyebrow. You stare at the wall where she used to sleep. You consider your options. Cry? Too cliché. Write a letter. Cute, but ineffective. No. This calls for something a little more Victorian lesbian with rage issues. You pick up a brick. The other women glance over. You don't need to say anything. They know. One woman tightens her bonnet. Another grabs a spinning wheel leg like it's Excalibur. Someone in the back mutters, "Well, I wasn't using that chamber pot anyway." This isn't just a tantrum, it's a tactical decision. You're going to get your girlfriend back. And if that means launching a full-scale uprising with whatever blunt objects you can find between the laundry and the latrines, then so be it. Because love may be a crime in here, but so is existing, so honestly. What's one more offence? Time to riot. In style. What followed was one of the most delightfully inconvenient uprisings in the history of British prison management. In 1842, at the Launceston Female Factory in northern Tasmania, a woman named Ellen Scott led a full-blown revolt. The reason? Her girlfriend, Catherine Owens, had been thrown into solitary. The solution? Take the entire prison hostage. This wasn't a quiet protest or a well-worded letter to the authorities. This was bricks. This was spinning wheels used as battering rams. This was Victorian lesbian fury, and it was aimed directly at the faces of anyone holding keys. According to factory reports, written in a tone of barely contained male panic, Ellen and her group physically seized parts of the prison, barricaded rooms, and repelled guards using household objects, foul language, and pure sapphic rage. The officials sent in the police. It didn't work. They escalated by bringing in male prisoners armed with crowbars and hammers. Yes, the official government solution to too many angry women was to call in some men with tools, which in fairness is still how most corporate emergencies are handled today. Eventually the riot was suppressed. But the shockwaves rolled far beyond Launceston. Officials suddenly realised the women weren't just being immoral. They were forming alliances, partnerships strong enough to defy authority, share punishments, and stage rebellions. To the Empire, this wasn't just a factory problem anymore. This was organised romantic resistance. Worse still, it was emotional. You can't flog feelings. Well, you can try, but as one government memo essentially whined, it wasn't working. From Cascades to Ross, reports poured in. Women were deserting the beds of those to whom they acted in the capacity of men. Some of them, officials claimed, were physically enabled to fill the vile part above mentioned, either through biological traits or, shall we say, creative contraband. One report even mentioned a suspiciously shaped carrot. Let that haunt you. Victorian society couldn't handle any of this. Not the masculinity, not the loyalty, and certainly not the idea that some women might love each other with enough passion to riot. Because it's one thing to have sin in the dark, it's another to organise around it. And as the flash mobs grew bolder, another panic began to spread. What if these women weren't content to just run the prison? What if they actually liked it in there? What if, God forbid, some of them wanted to come back? You wouldn't be the first. Because next, we're heading into the deeply confusing world of women who, given the choice between servitude in the countryside and a girlfriend in solitary, pick the handcuffs every time. They've decided you're reformed. Which is hilarious, because the only thing you've truly learned in here is how to make a tobacco pipe out of a button and identify 5 different types of contraband lace by texture alone. But no, According to your file, you've been sufficiently cleansed of vice. Congratulations. You now qualify for the worst reward imaginable, freedom. They assign you to a settler's homestead. You arrive to find a leaky shack, a screaming toddler, and a man who has the energy of stale porridge and thinks romance is when you don't get flogged for being mouthy. You spend your days scrubbing things that refuse to become clean and getting lectured about butter churns. At night, you lie in a bed that isn't a hammock, listening to crickets and longing for the sweet feral chaos of the prison crime class. By day 6, you've stolen a spoon on purpose and insulted the Reverend's horse. By day 7, you're back in custody. The moment you walk through the factory gates, the women cheer. Someone throws you a boiled potato. You're home. Catherine pretends not to look thrilled, which is fine. You'll settle that in the laundry room later. You've been reformed, all right. Reformed into someone who knows exactly where she belongs. As the years rolled on, a curious pattern emerged in the penal colonies of Tasmania. Convict women who were discharged, supposedly reformed and ready to become God-fearing domestic help, were actively trying to get sent back to prison, and not in the oops, I reoffended kind of way. No, this was strategic, tactical, emotional logistics. Because while the colonial government insisted that heterosexual marriage was the prize for obedience, many women found that prison offered something much more compelling: each other. Inside the factories, queer women had protection, companionship, emotional depth, intimacy that wasn't tied to a sweaty man with a sheep farm and one chair. Outside, you got isolation, suspicion, and work that never ended. The math was easy. Officials were baffled. Their meticulously crafted reformation system, complete with Christian lectures, ladylike sewing lessons, and desperate marriage incentives, was collapsing under the weight of lesbian loyalty. It got so bad, read Glorious, that the same women who had once schemed to escape the factory were now scheming to return. Some deliberately mouthed off to authority figures, others were caught stealing, drunk or insubordinate, a term that in this context usually meant too mouthy for a man's liking. And these weren't isolated cases. One particularly nervous administrator wrote that women discharged into the countryside frequently offend again with suspicious haste, and often showed no remorse when returned to the factory. You don't say. The authorities knew what was going on, even if they didn't want to say it out loud. These women weren't just refusing traditional roles. They were rejecting the entire premise of Victorian womanhood. In the middle of a colonised island designed to break their spirits, they'd created something radical, a queer sanctuary with better conversation and significantly more contraband lace. It terrified the system, because if prison became preferable to freedom, if love could be found behind bars, and if women would rather riot with their girlfriends than marry some guy named Archibald, well, what did that say about the empire? And worse, what if it started spreading? Because some women didn't just come back voluntarily. Some refused to leave at all. Next, we look at the rising panic over women who stayed too long in prison, and the disturbing lengths Victorian officials went to in order to stamp out whatever it was they thought was contagious. You're just trying to sleep, but the woman in the hammock above you is sobbing so hard the ropes are shaking like it's an emotional earthquake. Apparently her girlfriend got reassigned to kitchen duty, and now she can't function unless they're reunited before sunrise. Which is honestly fair. Who can focus when your soulmate is ladling porridge 3 buildings away? Across the room, 2 other women are having a full-volume breakup over a stolen handkerchief and a suspicious glance at someone's ex-wife. Someone else is carving initials into the wall with a spoon. It's a lesbian soap opera, with lice. And it's glorious. You've got routine, you've got community. You've got a woman named Bess who braids your hair while calling you idiot, in the most affectionate tone you've ever heard. You're thriving. Until you notice something strange. More guards, more sermons, more grim-faced matrons stomping through the dorms like they've just personally read your love letters and didn't like the adjectives. They're acting like something terrible has happened. And it has. The outside world found out, and Victorian society, delicate, uptight, and powered entirely by passive aggression and bad sandwiches, is about to have a complete emotional breakdown. By the early 1840s, the convict lesbian subculture that had thrived behind the stone walls of places like Cascades and Launceston was no longer a secret. And Victorian society, delicate, anxious, constantly one ankle away from fainting, went into full crisis mode. The Hobart Town Courier published salacious reports of women re-sewing their garments into male attire and sharing hammocks in ways deemed unholy. Another newspaper breathlessly reported that women were cutting their hair to imitate the masculine sex and openly engaging in unnatural affections. The horror. Even more disturbing to officials was the tone of these reports. They weren't just documenting scandal, they were implying the scandal was spreading. In response, the Empire panicked. And as always, when men in power panic, they do three things. 1. Write bad policy. 2. Quote the Bible out of context. And 3. Make everything worse. Suddenly, homosexual behaviour was no longer just a problem. It was a threat to national moral fibre, a disease, a social contagion that might, gasp, leap the factory walls and infect the general population. One reverend declared that the mere knowledge of such practices endangers the virtue of free women, as if lesbianism could be caught like typhoid from a side glance and an aggressively tailored waistcoat. This wasn't just about discipline anymore, it was about damage control. The colonial authorities feared two things above all. 1. That the women weren't being reformed. 2. And worse, that they didn't want to be. Because it's one thing to break the rules, it's another to make them look appealing. The Empire doubled down. Matrons were ordered to increase surveillance. Romantic behaviour earned you public flogging. In some cases, even unrelated offences were punished more harshly, just in case affection was hiding behind them. There were even attempts to separate mannish women from their companions, as if moving someone to a different cell would neutralise their personality. One administrator warned of women whose presence is magnetic to depravity, which honestly sounds like the best compliment anyone's ever accidentally given a lesbian. But despite the crackdowns, the love letters still passed hands, the secret names were still whispered, the loyalty and the longing refused to go away. Because for all the Empire's might, all the sermons, all the punishments, there was one thing they couldn't control: desire. And the more they tried to stomp it out, the more inventive and defiant the women became. The authorities could handle rumours, they could handle whisper networks, love letters, and even women refusing to marry men who smelled like salted beef. But what they couldn't handle, what they had absolutely no blueprint for, was when one of these forbidden entanglements turned violent. Because eventually someone would snap, and when they did, it wouldn't just be another prison scandal, it would be proof, in blood no less, that all their worst fears about passion, perversion, and women loving dangerously had come true. It started with a look, not a scandalous look, not even a particularly meaningful one, just a slightly too long glance across the yard during laundry rotation, the kind of look that says, "I might let you borrow my contraband lace if you ask nicely. Unfortunately, your girlfriend saw it. Unfortunately, she also has a flair for the dramatic, a history of smashing things when upset, and a deep-rooted fear of abandonment tied to her complicated feelings about cabbage soup." You tried to explain that it was nothing, just idle eye contact, a moment, a blink with attitude, but she's already halfway through composing an entire rage monologue, and possibly sharpening a knitting needle. Things escalate, there's yelling, there's pushing, someone throws a tin cup, someone else pretends to faint just for the attention. It's all very romantic in a toxic Victorian prison sort of way, until it isn't. Because now she's on the ground, and she's not moving, and you're standing over her, with a button still clenched in your fist, wondering how the hell a lover's quarrel turned into a highly regrettable homicide. Across the yard, three matrons gasp in unison like chorus members in a bad opera. The Reverend drops his Bible and starts sweating through his vestments. Someone yells, "Fetch the governor," and suddenly your name is being written in very large letters in a very serious-looking logbook. You're going to solitary. You're also going to make history, not in the way you'd hoped, with a daring love affair and a tasteful retirement in a one-room cottage with matching bonnets, but as Exhibit A in the moral decline of the British Empire. Because today you didn't just break a rule, you confirmed every single thing they were afraid of, and they're going to make an example out of you. For years, officials in Van Diemen's Land had muttered warnings about unnatural relationships, spreading corruption through the convict factories, emotional dependency, gender confusion, romantic sabotage, and whispered promises of eternal love exchanged over unwashed socks. But now, in the mid-1840s, one of these relationships turned violent. The name of the killer has been mostly scrubbed from popular history, because admitting too many specifics might mean admitting too much truth. But records describe a woman possessed with jealousy after her companion began showing affection to another inmate. The confrontation ended in a physical attack. The victim died, and the colonial authorities reacted with the exact level of grace and nuance you'd expect. A total nuclear moral meltdown. This wasn't just an isolated crime. This, they claimed, was evidence. Evidence that same-sex relationships weren't just sinful or improper. They were lethal. Headlines frothed with scandal. Reports described passions so twisted they defy womanly comprehension. Reverend Willoughby Dowling reportedly declared in his sermon that when woman abandons her proper affections, she does not love, she consumes. Dramatic? Yes, but useful. Because with a corpse on the books, reformists and moral crusaders could now demand even stricter punishment. Floggings became more common. Solitary confinement was handed out like party favours. The crackdown on anything resembling affection reached absurd levels. A hand on a shoulder could earn you a week in the dark. Officials praised the increased vigilance, but internally they were shaken. Not because a woman had died. The Empire was very used to that. But because the entire convict factory system had now been publicly linked to queer violence. Not only were these women refusing to reform, they were killing each other over love. It didn't matter that men killed each other every other Tuesday over poker and sausage rations. When women did it, it was unnatural. It was obscene. It was proof that the whole institution was infested with emotional deviance. The government wanted control. The press wanted a scandal. The clergy wanted repentance. And now they had it, all wrapped up in one tragic, messy, very public death. But not everyone was shaken, because while the officials were busy writing policy papers, the women inside the factories mourned, and whispered, and learned. They didn't stop loving, they just learned how to hide better, and some of them, quietly, stubbornly, and with no small amount of style, kept finding ways to stay together no matter the risk. Especially the ones who never left at all, the ones who found the outside world so intolerable. They came right back. You're not trying to cause a problem. You just like your sleeves rolled up, your boots properly laced, and your hair short enough not to catch fire when the soup pot explodes. Again. You sit a little wide. You laugh from your chest. And okay, yes, you do have a way of leaning against doorframes that makes people question their life choices. But now things are getting weird. The other women keep handing you things. Bread crusts, hair ribbons, tobacco wrapped in mystery fabric. One even gifted you a button with a suspicious amount of eye contact. Last week someone asked if you could help carry her bucket and blushed so hard she nearly combusted. You haven't even said anything flirtatious. You just exist. But apparently existing with shoulders is enough. You've developed a reputation, and not the sort that comes with a certificate. The matrons are whispering. The Reverend avoids eye contact. One particularly delicate factory inspector described your overall presence as threatening to the moral stability of the laundry wing, which is impressive, considering your biggest crime this week was sitting down too confidently and nodding at someone's girlfriend. Still, rumours swirl. Some say you've taken on masculine airs. Others insist you've corrupted 3 women and a jar of pickled beets. You don't even know what that means, but you're kind of flattered. All you know is that women are staring, matrons are sweating, and somewhere deep in the Empire's official logbooks, someone has just filed your name under problematic, possibly magnetic, definitely mannish. And somehow, you're okay with that. Throughout the convict factories of Tasmania, certain women began drawing more attention than others. Not because they were loud or violent or especially disruptive, but because they didn't seem particularly interested in performing womanhood the way Victorian society preferred. Soft, sad, and vaguely scented like dried lavender and regret. These women dressed more practically, cut their hair shorter, moved differently, spoke with directness. Some of them played the male role in romantic relationships, earning them nicknames, power, and in some cases terrified reverends clutching at their sermons like crucifixes. The colonial records labelled them pseudo-males. Superintendent W.J. Irvin, whose job apparently involved equal parts surveillance and over-analysis, wrote in one report that these women were distinguishable by their masculine bearing, deeper voices, and in some cases a development of the clitoris so pronounced it suggested a preternatural capability to perform as men. He then added, in a flourish of Victorian horror, that some women used artificial implements mechanically secured to the person to simulate the functions of a male organ. Translation: someone made a strap-on out of God knows what and it caused a full-scale moral crisis. But it wasn't just the sex, it was the swagger, the authority, the way some of these women walked through the prison yard like they were owed respect. And got it. The Empire could handle disobedience. It could even tolerate a little vice if it stayed quiet and repentant. But women who acted like men, that was too much. It wasn't just unnatural, it was contagious. One woman took on the husband role and suddenly half the dormitory was swooning. Another offered emotional protection and a spare blanket, and suddenly she was the de facto leader of her block. Victorian gender roles, already held together with hairpins and shame, were starting to fall apart under the weight of women who simply refused to behave. And make no mistake, this was dangerous. Because if a woman could be strong, assertive and desirable without the involvement of a man, if she could build love and loyalty entirely within her own community, then the whole framework of correction started to unravel. And worse, from the officials' perspective, some of these women weren't hiding it anymore. They strutted, they stared, they claimed space. And space, in the Empire's eyes, belonged only to men, which is why the crackdown came swiftly. Because the moment masculinity was no longer tied exclusively to trousers and paychecks, the Empire had a problem, and that problem needed to be shaved, shamed, and silenced, preferably before she picked up another admirer. But for every crackdown there was a smirk. For every punishment, a woman slipped another a wink across the yard. Because the power these women held wasn't borrowed. It was earned, claimed, reinvented. And next, we follow the story of the women who didn't just challenge the gender rules inside the prison. They took those partnerships out into the world. You live with your best friend now. Your very best friend. The kind of best friend who knows exactly how you like your tea, finishes your sentences, and has seen you cry while sewing a button back on your emotional support shawl. You share everything. The cottage, the finances, the stress dreams about accidentally marrying a man. You even have a child together. Her name is Marmalade. She's a cat. A large judgmental tabby who eats better than you do, sleeps in the middle of your bed like a goblin queen, and wears a tiny velvet collar embroidered with the word daughter. She's doted upon, worshipped, and regularly referred to as our little angel, in conversations where no one dares to ask follow-up questions. The village, of course, says nothing. Because officially you are companions, good, clean, unmarried women who bravely endure the harsh trials of rural spinsterhood by sharing a cottage and softly touching forearms in candlelight. Everyone smiles and nods. Your neighbour Mrs. Penwhistle once caught you two holding hands and pretended to sneeze so violently she nearly fell down a well. You attend church, you wear nice dresses, you never raise your voice unless someone implies Marmalade is just a cat, in which case your friend will calmly unhinge her jaw and issue a polite death threat in the form of a lemon tart. It's a simple life, quiet, proper, unassuming, and beneath it, deeply, gloriously, unmistakably gay. In Victorian society, romantic friendships between women weren't just tolerated, they were actively encouraged, so long as everyone stayed feminine, quiet, and eventually got married to a man like a good little angel of the hearth. These friendships, often intensely emotional, deeply intimate and sometimes physically romantic, existed in a hazy space between affection and plausible deniability. Women could write each other love letters, weep dramatically upon parting, and even live together without raising eyebrows, so long as no one wore trousers or tried to vote. These relationships came with charming names like special friendship, or in later decades, Boston marriages, referring to two women cohabiting long-term, often financially independent from men. In public, they were spinsters. At home, they were sharing everything from teacups to existential dread about being discovered. Society accepted them, partly because it couldn't imagine the alternative. According to apocryphal legend, when asked about criminalising lesbianism, Queen Victoria allegedly scoffed and said such a thing didn't exist. Whether or not she actually said it, the belief was widespread, that women weren't capable of real sexual deviance unless men were involved. This turned out to be extremely convenient for lesbians. Without explicit legal penalties like those inflicted on men, see Oscar Wilde, prison, and a public flogging of his soul, women could fly under the radar so long as they performed femininity convincingly enough to fool the neighbours. Even if everyone knew the truth, polite society operated on the Victorian version of don't ask, don't tell. We shall not speak of it, and if we don't speak of it, it isn't happening, and if it isn't happening, I don't have to explain anything to my aunt. As long as you didn't look too masculine or claim too much space or display too much authority, you could get away with quite a lot. And many did. Of course, if you started wearing boots and quoting philosophy, the mood changed fast. Mannishness was the line in the lace. Once you crossed it, all those sweet letters and shared gardens stopped being charming and started being suspicious. Victorian society was fine with women loving women, but not wanting to be anything other than women. That was the threat. That was the trouble. Still, these relationships thrived in city flats, rural cottages, and behind lace curtains across the empire. Some were quiet. Some were intense. Some were held together with whispered promises and mutual embroidery projects. And some looked a lot like marriages, which made them not only powerful, but dangerous. Especially when they showed up on stage as in public and in trousers, and everyone clapped, and no one knew quite what they were cheering for. You're at the theatre. You told everyone it was for cultural enrichment. It's not. You're here because she's performing tonight, your favourite male impersonator, and you've spent the past hour pretending you're excited about the music, the satire, and the witty lampoons of society's upper crust, when in reality, your entire nervous system is preparing for a controlled gay meltdown. The lights dim, a hush falls over the crowd, and then she steps on stage. Trousers, boots, a waistcoat so sharp it could slice through propriety. She tips her hat, winks at the audience, and speaks in a voice 1 octave lower than your willpower. The woman next to you clutches her pearls so hard they snap. You briefly forget your name. She struts. You sweat. She sings. You black out emotionally for 6 to 8 minutes. Your friend elbows you and hisses, "You're staring." You hiss back, "So is everyone else. I'm just doing it honestly." By the third act, you're contemplating whether it's possible to marry someone who doesn't technically know you exist. By curtain call, you're applauding with the intensity of a woman who's just seen God, but in pinstripes. And as she bows, you realise 2 things. 1, you're not alone in this room. 2, half the women here are having the same exact crisis. In a society that banned female trousers but tolerated Shakespeare, the stage became one of the few public spaces where gender norms could be bent. And Victorian theatre bent them with gusto. Cross-dressing performances weren't new. They were a holdover from the Elizabethan tradition, but in the 19th century they took on an entirely new flavour. Enter the male impersonator, a wildly popular staple of Victorian burlesque and music hall entertainment, who walked on stage in breeches and boots, and walked off with half the women in the audience metaphorically swooning into their parasols. These weren't subtle performances. They were confident, cheeky, and deeply queer, in a way no one could quite admit without their monocle falling off. The most famous of them all was Vesta Tilley, who built her entire career on swagger, charm, and showing up men by being better at masculinity than they were. She played soldiers, dandies, and gentlemen with such precision that crowds, especially women, adored her. And because she was a woman, it was allowed. Sort of. Male impersonators could exist because the performance of masculinity was considered safe, as long as it was temporary. The second it looked too real, or the affection from the audience got too sincere, people got nervous. But nervousness didn't stop the cheering. Because for queer women in the audience, these performers weren't just entertainment. They were a revelation. Here was someone allowed to wear trousers, someone allowed to flirt back, someone who made you feel seen, even if the script never said the words out loud. And sometimes, theatre wasn't just a mirror, it was a gateway. Actresses who played men on stage often blurred those lines off stage too. Some formed romantic relationships with other women, often under the protection of show business eccentricity. The world might call it artistic temperament. They called it Tuesday. Of course, society pretended not to notice, because admitting what was really going on would mean admitting that desire wasn't limited to men, that gender wasn't fixed, that identity wasn't always sewn neatly into a corset, and that for Victorian morality was far more shocking than any performance. Because when a woman in trousers could command a crowd, make women fall in love, and still bow with grace and poise, it raised an uncomfortable question. What if the roles weren't just pretend? And as gender got blurrier under the spotlight, a quiet revolution began off stage, in hidden rooms, behind locked doors, and in secret societies that had nothing to do with corsets at all. You've been invited to something exclusive. The note was hand-delivered, unsigned, and smelled vaguely of cologne and subtext. It instructed you to arrive after dark, dressed with a quiet flourish, and to speak of the event to no one, especially anyone named Reverend, Constable, or Mother. Naturally, you went shopping immediately. Now you're standing in front of a townhouse so elegant it probably charges rent to its own doorknob. The man who answers gives you a look like he's evaluating your moral flexibility, and you must pass the test because he steps aside and lets you in. Inside, the air is thick with perfume, piano music, and repressed emotion. Someone is reading poetry. Someone else is adjusting another man's cravat in a way that feels legally actionable. There's champagne, there are epigrams, there are a lot of pocket watches. You realise this is not a book club. This is a highly organised, deeply fabulous underground gay club, and you are in it. Someone compliments your waistcoat. Someone else calls you my dear and means it. A man with perfect eyebrows makes eye contact so intense it counts as a confession. For the first time in your life, you are surrounded by people who understand exactly why you wince when someone says normal. You're home, temporarily, secretly, but completely. While women operated behind lace curtains and companion euphemisms, Victorian men, especially upper-class men, created a different kind of escape. Clubs, codes, and covert organisations designed to protect queer desire in a world that wanted it buried. At the centre of this was the Order of Chaeronea, a real secret society founded in 1897 by poet and writer George Cecil Ives, named after the site of an ancient battle where the sacred band of Thebes, a legendary troupe of paired male lovers, had once stood. The order aimed to create a hidden brotherhood of homosexual men bound by shared identity, protection, and mutual support. Membership was by invitation only. Initiates were sworn in during clandestine ceremonies, given symbolic passwords, and often referred to in code as brothers. The group kept its existence quiet, not just because it had to — homosexuality was still punishable by imprisonment — but because it was designed to operate beneath the surface of respectable society. Ives believed the law would never change until queer people saw themselves not as isolated deviants, but as a coherent minority with shared interests, history, and pride. And while that sounds modern, it was being written in fountain pen on linen paper while wearing a cravat. Of course, not all queer men joined secret orders. Some simply met in coffee houses, pubs, art circles, or private salons, often organised by code and word of mouth. Certain green carnations in your lapel, a quote from Plato, or a glance held just a second too long could open doors, both literal and romantic. But the stakes were high. The 1885 Labouchere Amendment had criminalised gross indecency between men, a conveniently vague term that allowed for widespread arrests, blackmail, and public humiliation. No proof of intercourse was needed, just suspicion, just rumour, just a letter. For many, secrecy became survival, and so the codes continued. So did the ceremonies, the poetry, the private winks in public spaces. Because the empire may have defined morality in columns of legal text and poorly ventilated courtrooms, but the queer community built something else, a parallel world. And even there, even in the shadows, not everyone made it out unscathed, because while some clubs met quietly in drawing rooms, others were dragged into the light, by scandal, by tabloids, and eventually by trials that shocked the nation. You were just trying to mind your business. Really. You were having a quiet spring. You'd stopped writing racy poetry, stopped quoting Plato at dinner parties, even started using fewer adjectives in your letters, just in case someone got ideas. You were being good, boring even. And now you're watching Oscar Wilde get obliterated in court, and your entire nervous system is curled into a ball and whispering, "Well, this is the end of theatre." You're standing outside the courtroom with a crowd that includes at least 4 journalists, 3 society ladies pretending to be shocked, and one man loudly asking where Wilde gets his waistcoats. The air smells like lavender panic and social collapse. Inside, Wilde is on trial for gross indecency, which is Victorian for being too fabulous in public while kissing the wrong people. The courtroom is packed. The jury looks like they've never smiled in their lives. Wilde, bless him, is wearing a velvet coat and quoting Greek poetry like this is a salon and not a disaster. You briefly consider marrying a cousin and moving to the countryside. You also consider torching your monogrammed stationery and taking up mime. Because if they can take him down, the cleverest, wittiest, most gloriously over-accessorised man in England, the rest of you don't stand a chance. In 1895, playwright and professional quote machine Oscar Wilde was dragged into court and into history for the crime of existing too flamboyantly while gay. His downfall would become the most famous queer scandal of the Victorian era, a spectacular collision of wit, privilege, sex and hypocrisy. It all started when Wilde sued the Marquis of Queensberry, father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, for libel. Queensberry had publicly accused him of posing as a sodomite, which, while both insulting and badly phrased, was, unfortunately for Wilde, not technically untrue. The trial backfired, spectacularly, as Wilde defended himself with charm, style and alarming honesty. Prosecutors compiled decades' worth of letters, testimonies and rented hotel rooms. His famous wit, once celebrated in society drawing rooms, became evidence against him. His flamboyant fashion sense, suspicious. His affection for younger men, criminal. His epigrams, dangerous. One line in particular sealed his fate. When asked whether a certain phrase in his letter to Lord Alfred, "the love that dare not speak its name," referred to homosexuality, Wilde replied, "Yes, it is beautiful. It is fine. It is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it." The courtroom gasped. Victorian society clutched its collective pearls so hard the empire lost 6 colonies overnight. Wilde was found guilty of gross indecency, the same vague crime that had been quietly jailing men for decades. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour, a punishment so brutal it effectively destroyed his health, career and reputation. The fallout was enormous. Theatres pulled his plays, publishers dropped his name, friends fled, enemies celebrated, and for the queer community, especially the hidden networks of men and women trying to survive just below the surface, it sent a chilling message. No matter how brilliant you are, how beloved, how stylish or witty or careful, they will come for you. But even in disgrace, Wilde remained defiant. He wrote De Profundis, a scathing, beautiful letter from prison. He never apologised. He never renounced who he was. And after his death in 1900, he became a martyr. Not just for queer men, but for anyone who ever tried to live honestly in a dishonest age. Still, his trial marked the beginning of the end for the delicate illusion of safety. The empire had drawn a line. Public visibility now came with a price, and for many that meant fading deeper into secrecy, or disappearing altogether. But for some, especially a certain group of very determined women, it meant fighting back. With walking sticks, trousers and pamphlets, and one very angry suffragette who had no intention of asking permission to be complicated. You are not wearing a corset, which means, by Victorian standards, you are 2 missed curtsies away from becoming the Antichrist. Instead, you're in a loose blouse, boots made for kicking furniture, and a skirt with pockets so deep you could hide a manifesto and a small goat. You're riding a bicycle, which, to be clear, is less a mode of transport and more a four-wheeled declaration of war. Your ankles are showing, your hair is unpinned, you're going fast. You pass a clergyman who yells "harlot" and crashes into a cabbage cart. Good. You arrive at your companion's flat, our companion in heavy Victorian air quotes, and burst in like a hurricane made of indignation and printmaking ink. She's already setting type for your new pamphlet titled "Men, Do We Actually Need Them?" Marmalade the cat is curled on the table beside her, wearing a tiny sash that says "Head of Household." You've got lectures to write, laws to question, cravats to ignore, and a girlfriend to hold hands with under the table at the next suffrage meeting. Marriage? No thanks. You already share a mortgage, a cat, and emotional intimacy. What more does the law want? Blood. You're not trying to cause a revolution, you're just trying to live. But if it happens to scandalise half the empire along the way, even better. In the late Victorian period, a new archetype emerged. The new woman, educated, unmarried, politically active, and often suspected of having an inappropriate fondness for other women. She read books, wore rational clothing, smoked in public, and, most horrifying of all, had opinions. She was everything the Victorian ideal was not: mobile, mouthy, and mildly terrifying to any man named Reginald. Some new women married. Many did not. Some identified as lesbians. Others never labelled themselves at all. They simply refused to participate in the system that had treated them like walking wombs with embroidery skills for centuries. They formed intellectual friendships, domestic partnerships, and radical communities. They lived together, published treatises, and joined causes like the suffrage movement, socialism, and women's education, causes which all, conveniently, came with just enough rage to fuel decades of well-dressed rebellion. One particularly queer-friendly hub was the Ladies' Dining Society at Cambridge, formed in 1890 by a group of fiercely brilliant women including Edith Simcox, Eleanor Sidgwick, and Dorothy Balfour. Their unofficial motto: no men, no corsets, no apologies. Okay, not the official motto, but it should have been. Some women, like Ethel Smith, a composer and suffragette, were openly sapphic and positively feral about it. Smith once chased her crush through the countryside on horseback, and later composed the suffragette anthem The March of the Women while in prison, waving her toothbrush like a conductor's baton through the jail cell window. Others, like Vernon Lee, born Violet Paget, wrote essays on aesthetics and secretly loved her female companions with the kind of intensity Victorian poetry was made for. These women weren't hiding. They were redefining what it meant to live as a woman. They didn't just want liberty, they wanted space, and they built it. Yes, they were mocked in newspapers. Yes, they were called unnatural. Yes, people clutched their pearls every time one of them bought a typewriter or spoke Latin in mixed company. But they persisted, because they had work to do, lives to live, cats to spoil, and absolutely no desire to waste any more time waiting for society's permission. Not when there were still so many rules left to break. Like, say, kissing your lifelong companion in a public photograph and daring the world to figure it out. You've been diagnosed. Again. This week it's hysteria. Last week it was melancholia. And the week before that, the doctor told you your uterus was wandering aimlessly around your body like a confused goose. He seemed quite alarmed. You offered it a map. Now you're sitting on a stiff chaise in a man's office filled with dusty anatomy sketches and exactly zero actual understanding. The doctor is poking you with a metal stick and asking if you've recently experienced disturbing impulses toward other females. You say yes, especially when they look attractive while discussing Mary Wollstonecraft. He gasps, writes that down. You watch his moustache twitch like it's personally offended. He prescribes cold baths, brisk walks, less thinking, more embroidery, and marriage to someone named Charles, probably. You ask if there's a cure that involves moving to a cottage with your lady friend and raising emotionally intelligent cats. He frowns and recommends a clitoridectomy. You recommend that he try it first and get back to you. The Victorian medical establishment viewed same-sex desire in women as a kind of malfunctioning femininity, a deviation from what a woman should be. If you didn't want a husband, something was wrong with you. If you preferred women, something was dangerously wrong with you. Possibly neurological, possibly uterine, definitely someone else's problem to solve. There was no clinical term for lesbianism, not yet. Most physicians barely believed it existed, but those who did had thoughts. Terrible, beard-stroking thoughts. One theory claimed that romantic female friendships were harmless unless they involved excessive passion, which could cause degeneration of the nerves. Another insisted that too much education made women sexually inverted, particularly if they learned Greek, smoked, or spoke confidently in public. The 1870 medical text described a female patient who refused eligible suitors, preferred solitude or the company of other women, and exhibited signs of intellectual ambition. She was classified as suffering from sexual deviance brought on by literature. To cure this, Victorian doctors recommended cold baths, horseback riding, needlework and isolation, marriage, obviously. And, in severe cases, clitoridectomy, because nothing says sound medical reasoning. Like, let's just remove part of her anatomy and hope that fixes the poetry. Even the supposedly progressive sexologists of the late 19th century, like Richard von Krafft-Ebing, couldn't resist. In his book Psychopathia Sexualis, he described female same-sex desire as a neurological inversion, often resulting from uterine trauma or frightening dreams during puberty. Which raises the question, what exactly were these women dreaming about? And where can we get the sequel? But even in the face of medical horror, queer women persisted. They faked health, they smiled through diagnoses, they humoured doctors and then went home to kiss their companions and laugh into their soup. Some of them even used the system's cluelessness to their advantage, letting officials believe they were just sickly friends who needed to cohabitate for convalescence. Because if you're going to be called hysterical, you might as well do something worth the diagnosis. Doctors could pathologise your love. Priests could denounce it. Neighbours could gossip until their corsets snapped. But there was one thing even Victorian society couldn't silence: what you did with your will. And when death came, as it always did, politely and in black, it turned out that some women left behind more than lace and china. They left behind proof. You're dead, but tastefully. You made all the arrangements before departing, the kind of hauntingly elegant exit only a lifelong lesbian with organisational skills and a label maker could pull off. You left behind a will with footnotes. You chose the grave plot. You even picked the font for the headstone. Nothing cursive, I'm not a child bride. And most importantly, you made damn sure your companion would be buried right next to you. Centre left, slightly shaded, ideal for ghost picnics. Your cousin Gerald is furious. He thought he'd get the cottage. You left him a single teaspoon and a note that reads, "You always talk too loud." Meanwhile, your lifelong roommate in quotes now owns the house, the cat, the library and your ashes, some of which he plans to sprinkle in your favourite flower bed, and the rest to launch dramatically off a cliff in Wales. The undertaker tried to list your relationship as friend. You crossed it out and wrote everything in capital letters. Let them argue. You're not here to explain yourself anymore. You're here to haunt your in-laws and look fabulous doing it. For many queer Victorians, death was the one moment they could finally make things clear. In life, they had to disguise their love in euphemism. Dearest friend, beloved companion, my other self. But in death, they left behind wills, gravestones and household records that quietly defied everything the Empire said about what love was supposed to look like. Some women were buried side by side, their headstones etched with poetic phrases that walk the tightrope between Victorian sentiment and queer permanence. Phrases like, inseparable in life and in death, or together for eternity. Most people would read past it, but those who knew, knew. Take Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, for instance. American, yes, but admired even by Victorian-era reformers. They lived as a couple for over 40 years, ran a tailoring business together, shared a bed, and were buried next to each other under a joint headstone. Locals at the time simply referred to them as the ladies who lived together. The rest was implied. Quietly, firmly, or Anne Lister, the now famous Yorkshire landowner whose coded diaries revealed her passionate relationships with women, and who, in 1834, took communion as a form of marriage with her partner Anne Walker. After Lister's death, Walker moved into her home and was recognised as her heir. A legal bond not through a wedding certificate, but through sheer administrative stubbornness. And let's not forget the less famous but no less determined pairs. Women who left everything to their companion, who requested burial in the same plot, who donated to each other's charities and adopted each other's cats. Quiet acts of defiance scribbled in fountain pen and sealed with wax. Of course, it wasn't always peaceful. Relatives contested wills. Courts overturned inheritances. In some cases, surviving companions were evicted from the homes they'd shared for decades, labelled as lodgers or servants in official records. But others succeeded by being meticulous, relentless, and just petty enough to leave instructions down to the upholstery. Love, in the Victorian era, had to be written between the lines. But death? Death was an opportunity to underline it in ink, and sometimes those final acts of paperwork were louder than anything said in life. Because while the world debated their morals, these women quietly chose each other, in property, in legacy, and in eternity. Even if society never let them say the words aloud, even if they had to spell it out, in stone. Which leads inevitably to those who refused subtlety entirely, the women who put their queerness on public display, not in lace or letters, but in full uniform, marching into war like they had nothing left to hide. You're getting dressed, and it's not for tea. Today's outfit includes one stolen shirt, one suspiciously well-fitted pair of trousers, and one borrowed name that sounds just masculine enough to avoid questions, but not so masculine that it screams fake. You flatten your chest with a length of curtain sash, shove your hair under a cap, and mentally prepare to grunt more than speak. Congratulations, you're now a man, or at least a man by 19th century standards, which means you own boots, don't smile too much, and say things like, "Right then," for no reason at all. By breakfast you've joined a work crew. By lunch you're hauling lumber. By dinner you've been called lad, boy, and solid chap 3 times, and no one has noticed you're wearing your binder inside out because the lighting was bad and your life is a lie. You bunk with 5 other men who all snore like overworked donkeys. One of them teaches you how to spit. Another tells you about his fiancée and shows you a photo. You tell him you like lace too. He nods solemnly. At night you pull out a folded note from your actual sweetheart. The one back home with the soft hands and the sharper wit. The one who kissed you behind the bakery and said, "Don't get caught." You read it under your blanket by matchlight and mutter, "Miss you," into your shirt collar like a tragic romantic lead who smells like boiled socks. No one suspects a thing, because apparently the only requirement for being a man is shoulders and silence, and in that uniform, sweating, scratched and wildly over it, you've never felt more like yourself. Victorian society believed gender was divine, infallible and fixed, much like the empire's self-esteem. But plenty of women, particularly those drawn to other women, learned how to wiggle around the rules by dressing like men, serving in male jobs, or simply refusing to answer questions they found stupid. Some women did it to travel, others to escape marriages. Some did it because they loved another woman and wanted a life together outside the smothering confines of society's idea of friendship. And a few did it because trousers are objectively better than petticoats, and they had things to do. Enter the long tradition of passing women, those who took male identities and built entire lives around them. Some joined the military, some became doctors, some ran businesses or farms. Many lived quietly in same-sex partnerships while the world addressed them as Mr. and politely did not dig deeper. One widely reported case was Dr. James Barry, a military surgeon whose true sex was discovered only after death. Barry lived decades as a man, served across the British Empire, advocated for better conditions in hospitals and for enslaved populations, and still managed to confuse every biographer for the next 100 years. Some claimed Barry was a trans man, others a lesbian in disguise. All we know for certain is Barry lived as he pleased and took no nonsense. Then there were women like Catherine Hutty, arrested for impersonating a man but described by newspapers as clever and bold. The stories often mixed admiration with scandal, baffled by the idea that someone could want anything other than skirts and domestic obscurity. These were not always grand tales of rebellion. Sometimes they were about survival, sometimes about love. Sometimes they were about getting a job without being groped. Still, every pair of trousers worn by a woman without apology was an act of quiet heresy, a tear in the corseted fabric of gender roles, and often the only reason the truth came out was because someone died, or someone kissed the wrong person in public. Because no matter how many women lived in disguise, the Empire never stopped asking, "What are you hiding?" And queer women, very politely, continued to respond, "None of your business." The story doesn't end there, because some women stopped hiding altogether. They didn't just wear trousers, they wore uniforms, and walked straight into the fire with their love letters still tucked in their boots. You and your best friend are extremely close, like alarmingly close, even by Victorian standards, which already consider hand-holding an emotional commitment. You live together, you vacation together, you share a bank account, a surname on your stationery, and one particularly fluffy lapdog who answers to our son. You wear matching lockets containing each other's hair, and last Christmas she gave you a pressed flower in a frame and you wept like a war widow. Everyone says, "Aren't they sweet?" The vicar calls you inseparable. Your cousin Gertrude whispers, "Companionship like that is God's gift." You kiss her on the forehead and mutter, "God is really out here doing the most." You've already arranged to be buried side by side. You refer to each other as my beloved friend in public and my saucy wombat in private. You share a bed purely for practical reasons like, it's warmer and we're emotionally married but legally inconvenienced. The town assumes you've both simply given up on men, which is true, just not for the reasons they think. In Victorian society, romantic friendships between women were not only tolerated, they were practically encouraged, so long as no one said the word love too loudly, or did anything as vulgar as acknowledging what was actually going on. Letters between women could be full of flowery declarations like, "You're the light of my soul," or "I would rather perish than spend a day without your smile," and still be brushed off as sentimental overreach. After all, women were emotional creatures, weren't they? Some of these relationships may have been platonic, many were not. Take Boston marriages, long-term domestic partnerships between women, often financially and emotionally interdependent, and very rarely discussed by their neighbours in anything above a whisper. These arrangements were especially common among educated, middle or upper-class women who wanted lives outside of marriage, or who had already decided men were optional at best, obstructive at worst. Then there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Stacks of swooning correspondence written in violet ink, folded with sprigs of lavender, sealed with declarations like, "Forever your devoted girl." Historians have found hundreds, sometimes between women who lived together for decades, raised pets together, bought matching wallpaper, and still got listed as spinster cousins in the census. Some of the most famous women of the era wrote this way. Emily Dickinson, in her letters to Susan Gilbert, Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler, the ladies of Llangollen, who eloped in 1778 and lived together for 50 years, becoming the Sapphic cottagecore blueprint. Visitors treated them like local legends. Their home became a queer pilgrimage site long before anyone had language for what they were witnessing. The brilliance of romantic friendships lay in their deniability. You could be madly in love, wear each other's initials around your neck, and no one could touch you, unless you said the quiet part out loud. But over time, even those quiet relationships started raising eyebrows, especially when women stopped just writing poetry and started marching, publishing and organising together. Because eventually the Empire realised something uncomfortable. Women didn't need husbands, they had each other and a printing press. And nothing terrifies power quite like two lesbians with typewriter access and a firm opinion on trousers. You walk into the ballroom in a three-piece suit that could silence a bishop. It's navy wool, aggressively tailored, and says, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and no, I won't be explaining myself." Your boots click like a punctuation mark. Your cufflinks shine like small acts of rebellion. The pianist pauses. A monocle falls into someone's champagne. Your companion is wearing satin and smirking, Her hand is tucked into the crook of your arm like she owns real estate there. Which, to be fair, she does. You've both been the subject of 5 rumours, 3 poems, and 1 medical journal footnote. You haven't even reached the punch bowl. A woman fans herself and whispers, "Is she allowed to wear trousers?" A man chokes on a canapé. You tip your hat and say, "Legally? Yes. Emotionally? Not your concern. Your aunt is scandalised. Your tailor is proud. Your ex-fiancé is in the corner, slowly realising why you never liked his poems. You take a sip of champagne, adjust your lapel and offer your partner a dance. Because you didn't come here to cause a scene. You came here to be the scene. In the late Victorian era, a new type of woman emerged, or rather marched out in public and refused to blend in. These were women who dressed in trousers, cropped their hair, smoked cigars, and often openly loved other women, in a time when even the word lesbian was rarely spoken aloud. They were called mannish women, female husbands, or a problem for the moral fabric of society. But they were also trailblazers, queer women who challenged the gender expectations of the day with style, intellect, and sheer refusal to cooperate. One of the most famous was Radcliffe Hall, born in 1880 and known for her tailored suits, monocle, and open relationships with women. While Hall is often considered part of the early 20th century queer movement, her roots, and her rebellion, began squarely in the rigid expectations of late Victorian England. She called herself a congenital invert, a term coined by sexologists to describe homosexuality, and lived her life accordingly, unapologetically queer and unfazed by polite society's clutching pearls. There were many others. Some, like Vernon Lee, née Violet Paget, wore men's clothing, wrote supernatural fiction and essays on aesthetics, and carried herself like Oscar Wilde's emotionally scarred cousin. Others were artists, musicians, salon hosts, women who courted scandal not by accident, but by choice. Even Queen Victoria, when presented with the idea of criminalising lesbianism in 1885, as male homosexuality already had been, allegedly dismissed it, claiming women don't do that. Historians debate whether she truly said it, but Parliament agreed, and lesbianism was left legally invisible. Dangerous, yes. Socially punished, yes, but technically uncriminalised. That loophole gave bold women more space to operate, and they did. In public, they walked with their lovers. In salons, they flirted openly. In portraits, they posed in men's suits with expressions that said, "Go ahead. Try me." And for every one of them that made it into the history books, hundreds more lived in quiet resistance, working, publishing, living in partnerships, and dressing precisely the way they pleased. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about clothing. It was about claiming space, in rooms, in conversations, and in history itself. They could handle women in trousers. Barely. They could stomach a scandalous hand on a waist, or even 2 women sharing a home, provided the curtains were heavy and the neighbours were blind. But the moment a woman stepped on stage, straightened her collar, and became a man, all bets were off. Because now she wasn't just dressing the part, she was stealing the spotlight, and the ladies were cheering. You're standing backstage in full drag and zero shame. Your vest is buttoned so tight it could cut glass. Your trousers? Crisp enough to slap someone. Your moustache is glued on with flour paste and stubborn ambition. The mirror winks back at you with a look that says, "Sir, you're a menace." Your name tonight is Captain Frederick Beaufort Charming Esquire. You invented him 5 minutes ago, but he already has a backstory, a dramatic war injury and at least 2 ex-wives. The crowd is restless. You step onto the stage like a scandal in motion. The lights hit. The piano tinkles. And suddenly the audience is screaming. Not because they're shocked, but because they are unwell. Women in the front row swoon, clutch fans and fling flowers like they're trying to summon you into a marriage proposal. Men shift uncomfortably. One of them might be questioning everything. You hope so. You swagger. You sing. You drop to one knee and declare, "Madam, I would duel the moon for your honour." A woman faints. A gentleman coughs blood. Backstage, your scene partner grabs your cravat and hisses, "You were supposed to wink at Lady Maynard, not throw your hat into the balcony." You grin. Improvisation. It's called charisma, because here, in the footlights and flower paste and furious applause, you're not just pretending, you're becoming. And the moustache is staying on. Victorian music halls and variety theatres were packed with acts that pushed the edges of propriety, including a wildly popular genre, the male impersonator. These women didn't just wear trousers. They became men on stage, mimicking military officers, country squires, cocky lads and swaggering dandies. They sang songs in deepened voices, flirted shamelessly with women in the front rows, and got away with it all under the polite fiction of entertainment. One of the most famous was Vesta Tilley, known as England's greatest male impersonator. Born in 1864, Tilley began performing in boys' clothes at age 5 and spent her entire career dressed as men. She played soldiers, lovers, aristocrats, all with the confidence of someone who knew she looked better in a suit than any man in the audience. Audiences adored her. Critics called her clever, witty, and almost too convincing. Women copied her fashion. Men nervously laughed. Some tried to court her, not realizing she was in fact married, to a woman in all but name. Tilley wasn't alone. Performers like Hetty King and Ella Shields also made careers out of impersonating men, to both comedic and romantic effect. These acts gave queer women rare public space to explore masculine presentation, flirt openly and win affection, even if it was always couched in jokes and costume. Of course, the appeal wasn't lost on audiences. Theatres became places where gender could blur, where desire slipped through the cracks of performance, and where everyone, including queer people, could safely exist in a world of wink-wink, nudge-nudge ambiguity. But behind the glamour was real risk. Off-stage, dressing like a man could get you arrested for masquerade or intent to deceive. On stage, it was technically legal, as long as you stayed in character. The second the performance ended, and the suit came home with you, it became a problem. Still, the stage gave something few other spaces could. Freedom, a spotlight, a chance to see yourself not just as the world wanted you to be, but as you chose to be. And so the act went on, cravat by cravat, laugh by laugh, until the curtain fell and the audience stood to cheer the man who wasn't one. But what happens when the lights go out, the suit comes off, and the show doesn't stop? Well then, welcome to your final transformation. You're writing a poem that will never see the light of day, because if anyone actually reads it, you'll be diagnosed with hysteria, shipped off to a seaside asylum, and force-fed beef tea until you forget how vowels work. So instead, you hide it in your sock drawer next to 3 letters from your companion and a questionable fruitcake from 1872. It's a love poem, of course it is, but publicly it's titled Ode to the Evening Breeze. You rhyme ache with mistake. You pretend it's about birds. You scribble metaphors like, her presence was a garden, and I the humble spade, and pray no one reads too deeply into that. Your bookshelf is full of classics, all hollowed out and stuffed with secret notes, pressed violets, and at least one locket containing someone else's hair. Not creepy, just gay. You've even developed a secret filing system, books about queens equals actual queens. Poetry equals emotional chaos. Botany equals coded seduction. Your roommate, who shares your rent, wardrobe, and retirement plan, winks at you from across the room. She's working on a fictional short story about 2 women who go to Italy and never come back. It ends with them buying a cottage and adopting a dog named Virgil. It's subtle. You know someday someone will open this drawer, find your stash of tragically passionate sonnets and say, well, wasn't she sentimental? And yes, you were. But also you were in love, fiercely, gloriously, and under an empire that thought women like you were an urban myth. And now you're writing the ending yourself, because if they won't include your story in the history books, you'll just hide it in one. Victorian LGBTQ+ lives were often hidden, denied, or erased from official records, but that didn't mean they disappeared. Instead, they found refuge in diaries, poetry, coded letters, and carefully guarded private archives. One of the most striking examples is the life and writing of Anne Lister, often called the first modern lesbian. Her diaries, written partially in a secret code she invented, detailed her romantic and sexual relationships with women in vivid detail. The code wasn't cracked until the 20th century, and when it was, it revealed a life unapologetically queer, even if it had to be concealed behind cipher. Lister wasn't alone. Countless women and men documented their affections through language that blurred the line between friendship and desire. They used phrases like, "my beloved companion," "my better half," or "the one who understands my soul." When read aloud in the company of others, these sounded innocuous. But between two women sharing a home, a bed, and a life, they were declarations. Some wrote poetry under male pseudonyms. Others painted portraits that betrayed just a little too much tenderness. Artists, writers, teachers, and lovers. They passed down queer history not through headlines or trials, but through paper, ink, and memory. Even households themselves became part of that legacy. Census records from the late Victorian era reveal numerous single women living together well into old age, listed simply as friends or housemates. But the wills, the joint bank accounts, the shared burial plots, they told a different story. This wasn't just a survival strategy, it was a quiet rebellion. By refusing to vanish, by writing down what they felt, even if no one was supposed to read it, these Victorians left behind something priceless. Proof. Proof that they existed, that they loved, that they found joy and rage and humour and heartbreak, even in a world that tried to pretend they didn't exist. And now, as the final boot is unbuckled and the parlour glows with the warm haze of forbidden letters, gender-swapped opera rolls, and one particularly judgmental cat, I hope this ridiculous little stroll through Victorian queer rebellion lingers, like the scent of lavender sachets hiding love notes and regrets in equal measure. You've survived corsets used as closet doors, criminalised kisses, sapphic crimes of fashion, and more euphemisms for companion than should be legally permitted. But for now, it's time to rest. The scandal has cooled, the suit is back on its hanger, and your roommate/heir is gently snoring beside you, blissfully unaware that her name just got added to the deed in the epitaph. If you're still awake, impressive. You've just endured the Empire's most well-dressed attempt at pretending queer people didn't exist, and you didn't even get a government pamphlet or a monocle. Hit subscribe so we can slip into another tale of lace-lined defiance tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from moustached love songs and side-eyed sermons, and into sleep.